Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Henrik Urdal and I'm the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's PRIO Annual Peace Address. In the PRIO Annual Peace Address series, which has now been running for over a decade, we invite speakers from all over the globe, from a range of backgrounds and fields: academia, journalism, politics, activism, to speak on a topic of significance for peace and conflict in our world today. Since our inception in 1959, PRIO has stood for a close connection between academia and practice. The cornerstone has always been excellent and innovative academic research, yet always with an emphasis on utility and relevance for policy and practice. The distinguished speakers we invite to give our annual addresses are all, in their own ways and from different perspectives, experts on matters relevant to peace and conflict. They are here to enlighten us, inspire us, and challenge us to further our mission of working toward a world in which all conflicts are resolved peacefully. Last year, due to the pandemic, the Peace Address went ahead as an entirely digital event. And one of our speakers from last year is actually here in the audience today, the accomplished youth leader and peace builder, Hasher Sharif. Welcome, a special welcome to you, Hasher. While this online edition of the series was undoubtedly a success, I have to say, I must admit that I'm overjoyed to be able to welcome you all to an in-person event here in the center of Oslo. And not least overjoyed that our illustrious speaker has been able to join us here today. This year, we are honored to have Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs deliver the address. Professor Sachs is a highly respected economist and a leading authority on sustainable development. He is a university professor at Columbia University, where he serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development. Formerly, he directed Columbia University's Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016. He is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, an SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he has served as a special advisor to the last 3 UN Secretaries General and is the chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. Professor Sachs is a prolific author, having published numerous best-selling books, including The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. And in his most recent book, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions, Sachs argues for the urgent need for concerted global action to meet the challenges and opportunities for the 21st century. Sachs has twice been named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. Suffice it to say that I'm exceptionally proud to be able to welcome such a knowledgeable, insightful, and accomplished individual here to Oslo to deliver our annual peace address. Professor Sachs has chosen to speak to us today on a topic: why we must avoid a new Cold War and how to do it. I look very much forward to hearing you challenge and enlighten us on this issue of vital importance. The peace address will be followed by a moderated discussion between Professor Sachs and Sun Heidi Sæbø, the editor-in-chief of Morgenbladet, Norway's premier weekly intellectual newspaper, focusing on culture, politics, and research. But before we welcome you onto the podium, Professor Sachs, we will have a musical interlude. Performing for us today are Nawa.
Hi everyone, we are Nawa and we play Arabic music. We're gonna play today for you 2 songs. The first one, it will be intro of Egyptian song from the 50s. And the other song, we're gonna play it like maybe after 1 hour. And it will be my song. I wrote it last year. And I arranged this song with the beautiful musicians. So I hope you enjoy the music.
تعذبنا
Thank you very much to Nawa. And now, tonight's keynote. I look very much forward to hearing what Professor Sachs has to share with us. Jeff, please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Henrik, thank you so much for this kind invitation, and let me salute PRIO for your outstanding work, and also let me salute Norway for its outstanding and unique role in the world in showing a path for decency and nice politics, and a wonderful prime minister who's I've been lucky to have as a friend for the last 21 years, so I'm very happy to be here on that occasion as well. And I had a wonderful many years working together with former Prime Minister Solberg. She co-chaired the SDG Advocates Group for UN Secretary General. First Kofi Annan, first Ban Ki-moon, and then now Antonio Guterres. And she has been a wonderful leader of the SDGs on the world stage, and so I'm very grateful for that as well. I'm here because I know that PRIO's voice and your voice is so important for peace, and we're not in an altogether easy moment globally, not only because of COVID-19 and not only because of the many conflicts, especially in poor countries that are with us today, all exacerbated by the disruptions of COVID, most recently Sudan, the violence in Ethiopia, of course, the recent coup in Guinea. Secretary General Guterres has called this an epidemic of coups recently. So we're in a period of instability and turmoil, to be sure, but we're also in a very unsettling period of increasing tensions between the two major powers in the world today, the United States and China. And I want to spend most of my time speaking about that. It's almost taken for granted in US media that we already are in a Cold War with China. This is a horribly wrong-headed, naive, and dangerous idea. And we should not slide into such thinking, into the now everyday reporting in the US of China as an enemy, and the casual insults that fly in both directions between two nuclear superpowers who will, to an important extent, determine the fate of the whole world, certainly if they not only fail to cooperate, but enter into conflict. And that is not to be dismissed on the path that we're on. I wanted to speak about all of these things even before a headline last week made by somebody that I also have long admired, your former Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, now the Secretary General of NATO, who said in remarks last week that NATO's new doctrine that will be unveiled next year will be directed towards China. This is also a terrible idea, actually. And I wanted to take the occasion to say to Mr. Stoltenberg directly or indirectly, this is not a good idea. This is not what NATO should be about. NATO is not an overseas expeditionary force for misguided US adventures. NATO should not have been in Afghanistan for any reason. NATO, in my view, should not exist anymore. because it was to defend against the Soviet Union. And as far as I hear, that's no longer with us. And so we should end anachronisms and live in our current time with our current and distinctive challenges and problems. But we should certainly not repurpose NATO for a increasing tension with China. And to think that we could have a NATO doctrine that addresses China, but don't worry, that won't upset anything, is also extraordinarily wrong-headed in my view. How we address China will affect how China addresses us. And if we want to create an enemy, we will succeed in creating an enemy. That is basically what I want to speak about tonight. So the way to avoid a Cold War, I'll give you the punchline, is to think rationally and to understand our conditions and our circumstances. And for you in Norway and in Europe more generally to understand that the United States is not a rational actor right now. It is a country in a tremendous internal disarray. It will remain so for years to come. It is filled with bad ideas. And one of the ideas is the idea that we are in a confrontation with China. So that's the purpose of tonight's talk. And I'll start with what we all learn in conflict resolution or in the first day of game theory or in introductory economics, the prisoner's dilemma, because it really is an extremely important idea of what can go wrong, and the fact that economists treat it in a particular way and realists, so-called in international relations, treat it in a particular way explains a lot of what is wrong with our world. So in the prisoner's dilemma, in a dyadic relationship, in a two-party relationship, two people or two countries, we depict a set of choices. And here I depict a peaceful set of choices of China and the United States, or a path of increasing escalation of tensions, military or otherwise. And of course, these are the payoffs to the United States as the first number and to China as the second number. And the idea of the prisoner's dilemma is that the payoffs, or how we find ourselves, depend on the choices that are taken. And I will assert, for a number of reasons, that a peaceful world where both sides de-escalate is a higher set of payoffs than a world in which both sides are engaged in an arms race or increasing tension or even open conflict. So escalate and de-escalate can stand for all sorts of actions. Of course, the worst is open warfare, but also increasing tension, lack of cooperation in international challenges such as climate change, tremendous confrontation inside UN organizations such as WHO, as has occurred during the past year, and so forth. And in a prisoner's dilemma like this, the notion is that the peaceful approach, the cooperative approach, the mutually respectful approach dominates for both parties the conflict. But what also is the case is a temptation to let the, quote, softness of the other side induce an aggressive action and thereby gain an advantage. So if China de-escalates, but the United States escalates, maybe we win back Taiwan, or maybe we put China in its place in international financial relations or some other proposed advantage, and the United States ends up not at 5 but at 10, but imposes a very heavy cost on China, which has acted peacefully while the United States has acted in an aggressive manner, for example, in organizing the Quad countries, India, Australia, and Japan, in an increasing confrontation with China. So China sees that de-escalation is potentially quite dangerous. On the other hand, of course, if the United States cooperates, but China is tough, then the United States ends up losing. We lose face, we lose global leadership, we lose our place in Asia. We end up not at 5, but at -5, and China becomes the new hegemonic power. The great fear of the United States, that we are soft and China continues to build its military, and therefore we end up in a highly disadvantageous position. And the notion of this prisoner's dilemma, what has made this such a fascinating subject of study for the last 70 years since it was invented in the early 1950s, is the notion that if China chooses to de-escalate, the United States should optimally choose to escalate. And if China chooses to escalate, well, then clearly the US should also choose to escalate. Lo and behold, no matter what China does, the US preferred action is escalation. And similarly, if the United States de-escalates, China should escalate, because that gives China its hegemonic advantage. And if the United States escalates, then certainly China has to match that. And so no matter what the United States does, China should escalate as well. So the famous result of this game, as it's called, is that the dominant strategy for both sides is escalation. And the paradox is that the result is quite miserable. Both sides escalate, both sides build their arms, the tensions, maybe even war. Nobody wins from that, everybody loses. And yet this is the dominant strategy. And we end up here, the so-called Nash equilibrium. The idea of a Nash equilibrium, named after John Nash, is that one makes one's own strategy, taking as given the strategy of the other. And so in this case, no matter what China does, the US best strategy is to be tough. And similarly for China, and here's where we end up. And lo and behold, we have a mess globally. And so the fact that this is an equilibrium in some sense is a paradox, or certainly a problem. Now, what kind of problem? A problem of the following sort. If you actually have normal people play this game, mind you, that's not economists or economic students, they will more or less end up at de-escalation because of two things. One, that looks better. Why don't we end up there? And second, because in normal life circumstances, the two parties will talk to each other and say, you know, if we follow that, what did the professor tell us in class? It was a niche equilibrium, Nash equilibrium. Yeah, if we do that, we're going to end up as a mess. So why don't we cooperate and both win? And so what we find experimentally in two-person games if it's played out in classrooms, or, and especially if it's played out and you allow the participants to talk with each other, two people will normally be able to work out getting from this supposed equilibrium to getting to the better outcome. And one of the great issues of study for the last 40 years in economics is, why doesn't our game theory work right? Because we know that people should not cooperate. That's the rational thing to do. And yet people cooperate. What's the matter with people? That's the economist's view of this. By the way, if you give this to nursing students, they all cooperate. If you give it to economics students, they pretty much all escalate because they were trained to do so. So there is such thing in this world as trained incapacity. And it is very interesting that this is not an equilibrium in a sense we would consider in equilibrium, but in realist international affairs, this is considered the only realistic outcome. Of course, we have to have peace, but peace through strength. We're not going to be suckers. We're going to have peace through strength. And if peace through strength on both sides happens to lead to war, that's a shame. But strength on both sides is considered the only rational outcome. How do we get to the better equilibrium in a conceptual sense and in practice? A few ways. First, human beings have moral guideposts, and actually they feel bad being here if they have promised to be here. They feel guilty, actually, if both parties agree to de-escalate, but then one cheats. Okay, there are many other ways to reach an outcome like that. There can be treaties. There can be third-party enforcement. There can be a multilateral framework in which these two parties agree. There can be reputational costs of choosing here rather than choosing the cooperative approach. What what clinical trials show is that perhaps the single most important way to avoid this trap of deciding what to do based on each action and realizing that this is the so-called dominant or Nash strategy is for the two sides to speak with each other, because then they can work out that this is more a paradox than a true equilibrium in the point of view of well-being. And so in practical applications of this trial, this game, communication, even non-binding communication, meaning both sides promise to be here and then understand they play and both could end up cheating for the advantage. Prior communication has a decisive benefit for reaching the cooperative outcome. So this, I want to say, is, for me, still the basic paradigm that we have huge gains for cooperation in this world across all countries, but especially the two largest countries, the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, the two largest drivers of climate change, the two largest military forces in the world, the two major financial powers of the world now. And all of those lead to massive gains of cooperation and massive threats of conflict. And the core lesson is we should speak with each other and find ways to build that cooperation. It's not so complicated. Incidentally, how did we get to this game theory? I'm not sure, but it is probably the case. John Nash, who invented this, is probably on the Asperger spectrum. Historically, you know, he's the beautiful mind in the famous movie. His idea of games is interactions without communication. And in the Prisoner's Dilemma story in the 1950s, remember how odd it is. The two prisoners are each encouraged to cheat on the other one, but how? They're locked in separate rooms. So to make the Prisoner's Dilemma a story of game theory, communication was blocked. What's strange about economics as a field is this was taken as normal, rather than saying, that's an interesting but little bizarre story, Professor. The students say, yes, rationality, we cheat, or we escalate. And that, I'm afraid, is how we have trained generations of our foreign policy experts in the United States. So American policymakers assume that Chinese actions are fixed and that they are hostile. This was a story a few days ago in the Washington Post. The headline was, in advance of the climate summit, tension among Biden aides on China policy. Because John Kerry, the climate envoy, was saying, we stop being so mean to the Chinese. But the White House advisor, Jake Sullivan, was more skeptical that the United States alone can coax China into reducing emissions. And then a senior advisor says anonymously, they're going to make their decisions based on their national interest, said a senior administration official, dismissing the idea of cooperation. This is a thoroughly illogical statement. What is the national interest? It depends. It depends if we have cooperation. It depends on what the United States does. It's not true to say China will decide on its national interest irrespective of us, because that's a nonsensical notion that China's national interest is defined independently of our actions. But that is from a senior White House advisor. But let me show you what passes for foreign policy in the United States now. This is from the National Security Strategy of the United States, December 2017. This is our formal foreign policy. This has not been updated yet. China and Russia challenge American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. So the official doctrine is that China is out to erode American prosperity. They are determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries and to control information and data to repress their societies and expand their influence. These competitions require the United States to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. For the most part, this premise turned out to be wrong. Conclusion: China and Russia want to shape a world antithetical to U.S. values. Not contrary, not in favor, but antithetical to U.S. values and interests. China seeks to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, expand the reaches of its state-driven economic model, and reorder the region in its favor. Russia seeks to restore its great power status and establish spheres of influence near its borders. Then in 2018, it is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model, gaining veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. Now, why is this the present view of the United States? It's obvious that it is because of the major historical swing of economic history. In 1820, Asia had about 50% of world output. Europe, if I remember correctly, roughly about 25%, and the United States, perhaps 5%, at the beginning of the 19th century. This beautiful picture, which I will make sure that we can distribute afterwards, would show you that in the course of the 19th century, as Europe industrialized and the rest of the world did not, and as Europe increasingly encroached on Asia through imperial wars and imperial rule, Asia's share of world output declined precipitously, while Europe and America's share of world output rose markedly. And so by the end of the 19th century, we had a North Atlantic world. Of course, it was politically at that point mostly a British world. The British Empire was the dominant power of the world. It ruled the seas. It had possessions in all parts of the world. It constituted the largest power in the world, adding up its imperial possessions by far, though it was already eclipsed in absolute size by the US GDP. In the first half of the 20th century, of course, the world suffered multiple calamities, the worst in history in absolute destructiveness: World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And during that period, actually, Asia was brought into complete penury. China suffered civil wars, the invasion of Japan, followed by more civil war, so that by the end of World War II, Asia's share of world output was no longer half of the world, but Asia's share had declined to about 20% of world output in the aggregate, with 60% of the world's population at the time. So 1/3 of the average income of the world. By 1948, the United States, or in this case, North America, meaning Canada and the United States, was at about 30% of world output. And so the US was of course, the dominant power. Europe, including the former Soviet Union, so Europe was divided, not as a single force, but Europe as a whole was at about 40% of GDP. And if you add the North America and Europe together, the share of the North Atlantic in the world was still about 70% of world output. Look at what has happened since then. The US is shown here. The share of the United States in world output has declined from about 30% to, actually, today, to about 16% of world output. So the share of the United States in the world has declined by half. Asia, which is this line, of course, started to achieve remarkable recovery after World War II. First Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then after 1978, China, which followed the same East Asian development model. And by 2004 here, had already reestablished something around 50% of world output. We can look in a better way at the next graph at this point. in 1980, the Western nations, meaning the European Union, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, had about 60% of world output. By 2019, that had declined to about 30%. East Asia alone, China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN, had overtaken the United States, European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as a larger economic unit. And of course, what is the most challenging and grating on the US is this, that China itself, in absolute size, has overtaken the United States in size of economy measured at so-called international prices. That's an important distinction to make and to keep in mind. Measured in dollar prices, China is still a smaller economy. Measured at a common set of international prices, China is a significantly larger economy now than the United States. These are IMF figures. Now, one very important, actually fundamentally important point to keep in mind, China, of course, is more than 4 times the population of the United States, 1.4 billion people compared to 330 million in the United States. So the fact that China is larger simply means that China's per capita GDP is more than 1/4 of the United States. It's actually about 1/3 of the US in per person terms. US GDP now is about $65,000 per person. China's GDP is about $17,500 per person. China is still a middle-income developing country with a very big population. And the fact that it's a little bit less than 1/3 of the US, but 4 times the population, means that it's roughly 4/3 the absolute size of the United States. So China became a larger economy, but still in per capita terms, a poorer economy. But to add the salt to the wound, or the insult, or the fear of the United States, or this notion that China is out to get the United States, which is now the prevailing doctrine of the United States, China is having a dramatic surge of technological capacity because they have invested massively in science, technology, and higher education, producing hundreds of thousands of PhDs a year, with a massive focus on the basic engineering and science fields. And this is wonderful, in my view. Smart policy, proper economic development strategy, and I believe a major contributor to human well-being, because China's technologies are increasingly what we need to solve global problems. For example, China is the low-cost producer in the world of photovoltaics. China is the low-cost producer of wind turbines. China is the low-cost producer of long-distance, high-voltage transmission grids. And all of this is a huge advantage. In our work with my wife, China is the low-cost discoverer and producer of the best cure for malaria and has saved millions and millions of lives through artemisinin-based treatments that was development of a Chinese traditional herb, Qinghua, identifying the active molecular ingredients, artemisinin, and saving vast numbers of lives around the world. That's what technological progress enables. So, my view is that the nature of our bilateral relationship is, of course, a prisoner's dilemma kind of strategy. One can understand that there are huge gains from cooperation, but huge temptations as well. And that is why we need to agree with each other, to de-escalate, to keep away from an arms race, to keep away from flashpoints such as Taiwan, which is today's leading danger in the world for global annihilation, and a rapidly expanding one. You did not know it, but your lives, your family's lives, your children's and grandchildren's lives now depend on Taiwan. No, thank you. And no reason for it, except that we are provoking a crisis. So what happened as China grew? The United States reacted in, I think, the worst possible way. And this, for me, was the eye-opener essay 6 years ago. It was an eye-opener for me because, first of all, it was by a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School, Robert Blackwell. So I had to rub my eyes many times to believe what I was reading. But let's look at it first, and then I'll tell you why it was even more of an eye-opener. Blackwell wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations 6 years ago, since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally. Preeminent power, not cooperation, not security, but preeminent power. That's the always escalate in the prisoner's dilemma. During the Cold War, this strategy was manifested in the form of containment, which provided a unifying vision of how the United States could protect its systemic primacy, not security, primacy, as well as its security, ensure the safety of its allies, and eventually enable the defeat of its adversary, the Soviet Union. Because the American effort to integrate China into the liberal international order has now generated new threats to U.S. primacy in Asia and could eventually result in a consequential challenge to American power globally, Washington needs a new grand strategy toward China that centers on balancing the rise of Chinese power rather than continuing to assist its ascendancy. So when I read this, I thought, wow, Bob, what are you thinking? We're going to contain China now? But of course, I'm very naive, ladies and gentlemen, because this was already reflecting the new foreign policy. It was just being expressed in a pamphlet at the Council on Foreign Relations. It was not a trial balloon, it was the new foreign policy. And I read to you the subsequent versions of this in U.S. official doctrine since then. China's rise must be countered, not because of American security, but because of the need of American primacy. Now, how can a country of 330 million people have primacy over a country of 1.4 billion people if both are investing in education, in infrastructure, in new technologies, in research and development? How could a country of 330 million people do that? The answer is there is no peaceful way to do that. There is only a containment strategy. A containment strategy means that China must not be allowed to develop. Because if it does develop, primacy is impossible. Numerically, it's simple. It's too big to be allowed to develop. And so this is the genesis of why you can't speak on a Huawei phone, use Huawei 5G, engage with China in normal infrastructure development such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and why Jens Stoltenberg said last week that the new doctrine of NATO must be directed towards China. Because U.S. primacy, not security, but primacy, is threatened. I won't read all of that, except it's more insults by the United States about China, about how in many areas China's leaders seek unfair advantages, behave aggressively and coercively, and undermine the rules and values at the heart of an open and stable international system. That's Biden's doctrine. We will support China's neighbors and commercial partners in defending their rights. We will promote locally led development to combat the manipulation of local priorities. We will support Taiwan, a leading democracy and critical economic and security partner. We have a one China policy, which we are now steadily undermining and intending to abrogate, up to and including Biden's new doctrine of last week, saying we will defend Taiwan against an attack, which is not a US doctrine, but it has become one. No vote, no debate, no discussion about how reckless this talk is. If one wants to provoke an attack against Taiwan, the best way to do it by the United States is to say, we will defend Taiwan and its independence, and then give vent to the independence voices in Taiwan to also abrogate the one China agreement that goes back decades between Taiwan and the PRC, incidentally, and that was part of the ROC, the Republic of China's core from 1945 onward, that there is one China. But we are now undermining that and setting in motion a slide to war. Not deliberately, but we're doing it because we're talking about the importance of defending Taiwan when that wasn't even an issue, because China wasn't talking about invading Taiwan until we started talking about defending Taiwan, and until President Tsai started to enunciate every kind of strange idea, including the recent one that Taiwan is not an Asian country. It's a Western country. That, ladies and gentlemen, is provocation. That's not safe. That's not smart. That's not prudent. That's how to construct an enemy that wasn't an enemy. So this is the one that got me really unhappy last week. Significant broadening of the alliance's objectives. Let's talk about China for a moment by looking at the United States first. I come from a country that has abandoned multilateralism, and not just under Trump. These are all the UN treaties of the last 40 years that have not been ratified by the United States. We don't ratify treaties anymore because in the US Senate, it is believed that if the rest of the world agrees on something, it must be bad. It's almost proof that it's bad. The United States passed laws to protect the disabled. The other nations of the UN thought that was such a splendid idea, they made a treaty on disability, at which point the United States refused to ratify it, even though it was based on US law and insight. Why? Because it was a UN idea. So we have not ratified the law of the sea. We have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have not ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have not ratified the Mine Ban Treaty. We have not ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions. We are not a party to the International Criminal Court. And that's the US side, mind you. Almost all of those, I didn't get a chance to check one by one. I will do so in the final write-up of the lecture. But China is a party to almost all of those, if not all of those. These are US wars. We've not had a peaceful year really since 1945. The US is engaged militarily all over the world. Today, it's bombs over Yemen still. It is operations in Libya, in Syria. It is operations in Somalia and other places. So this is a list of all of the wars and coups that the US has led since World War II. In the case of China, China has not been engaged in one overseas war for the last 41 years. The last time was in Vietnam in 1979. And that was after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and China invaded Vietnam for 2 years and then left. Since then, not one overseas war. These are US military bases around the world. There are 800 of them at last count. Remember how China is trying to militarize the Indo-Pacific? I'm afraid the US got a big head start. We have bases all over the South China Sea, surrounding China. And when the Biden administration opened, what was the first trip of our new defense secretary? It was to India, Australia, and Japan, the so-called Quad countries, because we want to tell China, we surround your shipping lanes. And we have just agreed to escalate further by providing nuclear submarines to Australia in a new expanded military alliance, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. This is again a US provocation, and since it's nuclear submarines, it's a major escalation in the South China Sea as well. The United States exercises another kind of power, also against international law, and that is the rampant and increasingly frequent use of unilateral financial sanctions, which are, by the way, very, very powerful. You can wreck a country, drive it into poverty and hunger through a blockade of its banking system, and by the threat of extraterritorial sanctions on anybody that does business with the country. So the United States has starved Venezuela during the last 5 years. My theory is that it was all in the interest of winning the 2020 election by Trump, because Trump could care less about Venezuela. But he was told by Marco Rubio that he could carry Florida if he could take a strong anti-Maduro stance. And so the US financially blockaded Venezuela, and Venezuelan income has declined by about 75%. It's as if we went in to bomb, but you don't have to bomb. You just have to seize all of the financial assets offshore, and you have to block any kind of financial transactions with the country. We're doing that all over the world. So if one asks who upholds the international system, please be sure to understand that China is not the relentless aggressor in this story. The United States is repeatedly, profoundly, and consistently fighting against the international system now, leaving UN agencies, fighting against meager UN budgets, failing to ratify UN agreements, going to war unilaterally against UN Security Council decisions, imposing unilateral financial sanctions, building military alliances, failing to abide by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which calls on nuclear powers to denuclearize, whereas the United States is entering a new generation of nuclear weapons building. So this is the problem. And it is in the interests of a grand strategy and in the belief that the only rational thing to do is to escalate, because no matter what China does, that's in our advantage. So, where does that leave us? The world is extremely unsettled right now because the United States actually can't lead even if it pretends to. We are 16% of the world economy now, not 32%. We do have the only world currency, but it can only be used for destruction, not for construction. The US is unwilling to finance global public goods. Our aid level is 1/6 of yours in percent of national income. Norway, 1%, US 0.16 of 1%. So we are selfish, divided, aggressive, militarized, non-cooperative, and interested in primacy. And NATO's going to sign on, ladies and gentlemen. Sign on to that, because after all, China's the threat. So I wanted to end by talking about theories of our current situation. We don't have a global hegemonic power anymore. The United States served that role for good and ill for 3 decades after World War II. Hugely for the good at the beginning in establishing the international institutions, the greatest foreign policy act of the United States in history was certainly leading the development of the United Nations, the UN Charter, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then we entered into a nearly disastrous nuclear arms race, and partly on the view that there was never anything to discuss with the other side. And that brought us to within a breath of nuclear annihilation on October 26, 1962, when a series of miscalculations led to the near annihilation of the planet. Remember, the bombing bay was already loaded with a nuclear-tipped submarine, and the Soviet submarine pilot had already given the order to fire when he was countermanded by a single official on his vessel in the Caribbean. And we know from the aftermath and from US doctrine that had that torpedo fired, it would have been the end of the world. Because the US doctrine was any nuclear attack would be met by a full-scale attack against the USSR, China, and Eastern Europe. And we didn't know then what we know now, which is that that would have ended life on the planet, because the idea of the nuclear winter would only come another 10 years later. So that's how close we came the last time. When I was a graduate student, we read this book. The book was a brilliant essay about why the Great Depression was not solved in the 1930s, and Kindleberger's answer was because there was no hegemonic power to provide the global public goods to end the Great Depression. Britain was wounded, the United States was not in a leadership position, and so Kindleberger, I didn't understand it at the time, but it was mainly, in a way, a hidden defense of US hegemonic primacy after World War II. Maybe not written for that purpose, but the argument was no leader, no public goods. Another idea of our time is, well, we won't have a hegemonic leader. We'll have China, the United States, European Union, other powers, India, other nuclear powers, and so we'll have a balance of power. And this is Henry Kissinger's idea, of course. The only problem with this is that it is unfortunately a myth, the idea of a balance of power. Because power doesn't stay balanced, it becomes imbalanced. And while Kissinger devoted his life to trying to recreate the worlds of Metternich and Bismarck, the fact of the matter is that when Bismarck died, no one was smart enough to keep the balance of power in Europe. And within years, an alliance system had developed, and in 1914, it brought the worst disaster that Europe had experienced in its modern history, followed by yet another disaster just a generation later. So I'm not much of a fan of balance of power theory. That's realism theory. That's we both escalate. It's not as good as cooperating, but since we both escalate, neither side gets an advantage. I see that as an invitation to an accident like August 1914, or an accident like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I know that there is no balance. There's change, there's threat, there are stupid people, there are psychopaths. We had one as president, and we should not count on a balance of power. There's another idea, of course, that's very extant now. It's even, if you read, and I don't recommend it, the comment pages in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, it's enough to ruin your day, by the way, if you do it in the morning. And it will keep you up all night if you do it late in the day. But it is taken for granted by the many misanthropes around the world, or the people who believe that the Nash equilibrium is the only true equilibrium in the world, that of course we're going to war. Why not? Athens and Sparta did. But Athens and Sparta, one thing one can add as a footnote, both ended up in disaster. That's one footnote to the Peloponnesian Wars. The other is they didn't have nuclear weapons. So this is my humble theory. Why don't we cooperate? Why don't we understand that we are not mortal enemies, that China lived through a terrible century and a half at European hands, that China is a great civilization that deserves respect, study, cooperation, interaction, serious engagement, and that we have a lot to do together, and that it's urgent. China is the #1 greenhouse emitting country in the world, 28% of greenhouse gases. The United States #2 at 14%. Mind you, if you do it in per capita terms, the US is roughly twice China's per capita emissions. We have to work together, otherwise we will absolutely destroy the possibility of prosperity on our planet. and on so many other issues. We are missing a proper doctrine of global cooperation. And I think the idea of subsidiarity is the right idea. Subsidiarity says we have many collective problems to solve them at the most local possible level. But then understand that some of our problems are truly global. COVID is a global problem. We cannot end COVID country by country. We need everybody to receive immunizations. Climate change is a global problem. We cannot end climate change country by country, and so forth. So in the doctrine of subsidiarity, we recognize public goods at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the local level, at the neighborhood level, and inside the household. And we commit to cooperating collectively at the right levels in the right ways, because cooperation beats war, and it really beats nuclear war. So many critical areas for cooperation to end global poverty, protect the environment, resist inequality, which requires global agreements on taxation, manage complicated demographic change, and maintain peace. And the Sustainable Development Goals are our generation's plea for the world we want, and every one of them requires collective action at multiple levels, from global to local. None can be achieved without global cooperation. We need now to avoid the slide that we are experiencing. And believe me, it's happening. And you may not feel it in Norway, because this is a wonderful country with sane politics and nice people. Come to the United States for a moment and see the risks. Let me point out one reason, by the way, why China will not be the new hegemon. It doesn't, not only are we not going to have a new hegemonic power, not only is China not going to take over the world, not only is it too poor to do so, not only is it too small to do so, not only does it have a few obstacles of other parts of the world that actually don't want China to run the world, and not only has it never been part of China's statecraft, ever in 2,000 years to imagine running the world, ever, in any way, including today. But I just want to point out a little bit of demography. This is East Asia, the share of the world population this decade. Right now, China is about 18% of the world population, because it's roughly 1.4 billion people out of roughly 8 billion in the world. By the end of this century, China will have not 1.4 billion, but 1 billion people. And the world will have perhaps 10 or 11 billion people, depending on how we manage it. Should and could have 8 or even 7.5 billion people in a proper world where children get education and families decide on fertility based on their education levels and access to decent jobs and so forth. But the point is, Asia will be around 10, East Asia and China will be 10% of the world population, not even 18%. And China is going to be one of the oldest societies in the world, with a median age of perhaps 57 or 58. I have a theorem. I'm not sure. It's actually a hypothesis. I don't believe people over 58 want to run the world. I think they want quiet, actually. That's my own feeling. I don't want to run the world. I don't want to see it blow up. And I don't think that China is going to be in a position to run the world. Africa, by the way, is the line that is soaring upward. And that, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that on the current trajectory, Africa's population will rise fourfold, from a bit over 1 billion to more than 4 billion. It should not do so for Africa's own well-being. It would not do so if we cooperated globally to ensure that every young child in Africa is in school and is able to stay in school until at least upper secondary education, because that is the way to achieve development and the fertility transition, in which case that curve would peak and start to come down, all for Africa's own good and for world stability and sustainability as well. But this is just to say, don't lose sleep about China taking over the world. If they do, it will be octogenarians doing it, and I don't expect that to be the case. Let me conclude by saying we are gifted by one very fortunate circumstance in our time, which makes us not quite unique because it's been true for the last 75 years, but the generations since 1945 really have something special compared to all of humanity that went before, and that is we have the United Nations. It's a brilliant idea. Of course, it was a brilliant idea when it was the League of Nations, but it was stillborn. It was a brilliant idea. Franklin Roosevelt, truly our greatest president by far, I think. And it is our best hope, because what the UN Charter calls for is peace, cooperation, sustainable development, and the international rule of law as a basis for cooperation. And this is our instrument to actually solve the problems that we face. There's also one other important point about the UN that is very special. It not only has a political charter, it has a moral charter, a most remarkable moral charter. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one of the most stunning achievements of humanity, because it showed that it was possible across all cultures, of course, in the context of the Holocaust and of the devastation of 2 world wars, to see that there is a common ethics for all humanity. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 is a wondrous base for us to build. It's signed by China, it's signed by the United States, it's signed by all the UN member countries. Brilliantly, it's not only, quote unquote, only about political and civil rights, it's about economic rights, cultural rights, social rights. It provides a body of law. It provides a system of engagement. It provides a basis, ladies and gentlemen, for us to live together prosperously, decently, and peacefully in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that very engaging, sobering, inspiring, and occasionally also a bit shivering lecture. We'll be hearing more from you very soon, but first another musical contribution from Nawa.
for having us.
Thank you so much to Nawa for a wonderful performance. Then I think we'll be getting the panel up here. It gives me great pleasure then to introduce Sun Heidi Sæbø. As I said at the outset, Sun Heidi is editor-in-chief and CEO of the Norwegian weekly newspaper Morgenbladet. An accomplished journalist and author who has published several critically acclaimed books on North Korea and China. And I know that you also share the sentiment that talking about how to engage China is one of the big issues of our time. So I'll give the floor to you, Sun Heidi, for a comment on Jeff's presentation.
Thank you. I think we did a pretty good job last night at dinner not talking about China. Of course, we were so closely monitored by Henrik that we had no choice, really. But I'm happy that we're here tonight and able to discuss China in more depth. I think we can all agree on the need to avoid another Cold War, however that may look in the 21st century. But while the anti-China rhetoric and sentiment seems to gain more traction each and every day, it's hard, if not impossible, to see who will benefit from, prolonged political divisions, stalemates, and, an expensive arms race, and I'm not even talking about the nuclear war. And given the economic cooperation and the integration between China and the US, China and Europe, and China and the rest of the world, I don't really think we can truly comprehend the consequences of a Cold War. I think maybe, the post-pandemic disruptions to the global supply chains, the product shortages, price increases, it offers just a small and perhaps innocent glimpse into what the future might hold if we are to slip into a new Cold War. I think this trend that Jeffrey Sachs was talking about points directly to an interesting paradox in current international affairs, where on the one hand, there's an alarmist approach to China. There are these explicit warnings about Beijing's, so to speak, true intentions. There's a lot of concern about their military buildup and the security risk associated with, let's say, the technology developed by Huawei, even their handheld devices. And on the other hand, simultaneously, there's a push for strengthening economic ties. Even Norway has been negotiating for a bilateral trade with China since 2008. Now, what both of these approaches have in common is to simply strengthen China and enhance the image of a global superpower. So while Jeff Sachs here spends a lot of time looking at the US, I would like to have a closer look at China in the upcoming discussion. What does this superpower look like, and what are Beijing's true intentions? Professor Sachs looks at China and sees a nation that is very determined to build a multilateral world order and is working through the UN. And I'd like to pause there for a moment and raise the question, what kind of multilateral path is China seeking? Certainly, if one looks at the statements made by President Xi Jinping and his top diplomat Yang Jiechi, there is no doubt China is very intent to avoid a hegemonic world order and instead promote international cooperation. And since the 1990s, China has, for instance, made considerable contributions to the UN peacekeeping forces, and they do seem committed to achieving global and sustainable development. And overall, one might say that Western countries nowadays, they're more prone to undermining the legitimacy of international organizations. We see this in Europe, but we've also seen it certainly under the former Trump administration. China, on the other hand, seem more ambitious and more willing to put resources and manpower into these organizations. But I want to, explore how much is this really about building true multilateralism, and how much is it about, Beijing's own push for dominance, their own agenda, and their own sets of values, and thus perhaps countering the US as well. I think there is a case to be made that China is seeking regional dominance. For instance, if we look at their naval fleet and the increasing number of battle force ships, China's Navy battle force has tripled over the last 2 decades. And the strengthening of military capabilities, together with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the recent events with fighter jets and warplanes over Taiwan, is this the face of multilateralism, or is this a strive towards regional hegemony? And while some point to the Belt and Road Initiative as an international project aimed at promoting a green and sustainable development, it is in fact an expansion of global infrastructure that was launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013. And I think it's fair to say that much of the work, the expansion, is done on Chinese premises and even by Chinese entrepreneurs and with Chinese finances and loans. And if we are to define multilateralism, one might argue that respect, in China's case, for smaller countries is a precondition. So if you look at how China has acted towards Australia this past year by targeting Australian goods as economic punishments for statement made about the pandemic, or how China has acted towards Lithuania when they announced the opening of the Taiwanese representative office in the capital, or in the case of Norway, when the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, and our bilateral relations were, it took 6 years before they were reestablished. And so, is this the behavior of a multilateral country, or is it more nationalist? So I'd like to, talk more about what do we see as the true characteristics of Chinese multilateralism?
Thank you very much, Sun Heidi, and I'll allow Jeff to respond a little bit. I just wanted to reflect on, I think, one of your last slides with the demographic changes, and I guess I have a bit of a hang-up, since that's also in my keen interest. But it demonstrates, I think, very clearly what we now see as the paradigmatic shift, which we know will shift again quite soon down the road. And it's the expectation that China will grow old before she gets rich, and perhaps that we will see what we call in peace research the geriatric peace, where precisely the East Asian region will grow old and perhaps as a result of that also become more peaceful. But I wanted to.
So there is that concept.
The geriatric peace, yes.
I believe it.
Yes. No, I have a chapter in the book here that I'm going to give you afterwards on the East Asian peace, where that term is also used. But I wanted to I will
propagate the term as best I can.
I wanted to challenge you a little bit, Jeff, and it's your prerogative as a U.S. citizen to criticize U.S. positions and policies, and I think many of us can appreciate also much of that. It's important to have that discussion. But it's of course also, and I think to get that cat out of the bag, quite significant challenges also with the Chinese human rights record, and you've been writing about this yourself in many of your writings, both with respect to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the question is, how can we manage to balance, the sort of constructive engagement with China at the same time as we're keeping also China accountable for what China is doing in terms of human rights abuses?
My feeling is that China is actually 2 points to start. One, China has a statecraft of a centralized authoritarian state that goes back 2,000 years. So what we're observing is a deep part of China's culture and history. That's important because political culture is a deep-seated part of societies. China's centralized state was established in 221 BC, and though imperial dynastic transitions were sometimes messy, it's been more or less 2,200 years of continuity of political culture. Of course, I hope and believe that it should and can change in the future as well. And in fact, just these last few weeks, President Xi Jinping is talking a lot about more inclusive democracy. It means something else from an election next month under the terms that Norway would have it. But it's also far from insignificant or pandering. This is for internal discussion, not international discussion, this idea. So that's one part that I want to put on the table. Second part is China really feels that, I mean, Chinese ideology and history are based on the premise that the outside world is hostile to China. That is not an irrational idea. It's true, actually. And at least in the modern period from 1839 onward, the first Opium Wars, then the second Opium Wars, then one damn thing after another. Outside powers tried to break China, control China, steer China, own China, dismember China. And so part of the Chinese statecraft is based on one idea, very strong idea, which is also a UN idea. Don't meddle internally with us. We will cooperate with you, but don't meddle internally. That, in a simplified way, is how China interprets the UN system. We might say, no, it's more than that. It's also we get the right to meddle internally because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. These are points I think we should live with in tension, discuss, and so forth. But I would not start out in each discussion of a U.S. official with China, hey, how's Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang? That's how we open the discussion right now. What does that mean to the Chinese recipient of that? It means you're playing games with us. You want to break away Taiwan. You want to break away Hong Kong. You're meddling with our core issue, which is our internal stability. Don't go there. So that's, I think, basically what we're experiencing right now. These are not innocent questions that are being raised. These are provocations as well as questions. By the way, Donald Trump or none of the American presidents cares so much about human rights almost any other place in the world. Because this is questioning for tactical reasons, the ones I showed. We're trying to weaken China. We're trying to provoke, to goad, to create alliances. And when you point out about the military buildup, understand it's against a giant U.S. military presence. So no matter what China does, the U.S. is here, China's raising here. And it's interesting, you know, the U.S. has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And it has, I don't know how many, I should know, but I don't recall, maybe 1,400 or so that are active. China, a tiny fraction of that. And so when China increases its strategic nuclear force, the headlines in the US, China aggression. But this is the oldest story of a defensive reaction being described by the adversary as an offensive reaction. What China's doing, in my opinion, in the South China Sea and with its Navy, is to prevent the US from strangling China's sea lanes. period.
So they're merely responding to U.S. force.
They look at a map. The U.S. is completely surrounding China with bases all up and down what we call the Indo-Pacific. China calls the South Pacific Sea. The U.S. has military bases. China does not have offshore military bases anywhere except a small refueling station in Djibouti. The United States has 800 military bases. And the United States looks at the sea lanes. China looks at the sea lanes and understands perfectly well those are choke points. That goes back to core U.S. military doctrine of Alfred Mahan of 1904. And China looks at the same map. And that's why it's arming the atolls, because it's making sure that its sea lanes are open. This is going
to change with the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
So the Belt and Road Initiative is a wonderful idea to bring infrastructure to places that don't have modern infrastructure. And it's an even cleverer idea that China has all this industrial capacity, so it will finance it and it will export. It's good economics. It's good for the recipient countries. It's exactly what the United States used to do. So I applaud it. It's smart.
I'd like to respond to the issue of Xinjiang. I mean, China has a long history of political culture, but the systematic suppression of Uyghurs is quite recent, and it's happened in the last years. And I do think we have a responsibility to focus on Xinjiang and the human rights there, even though, the US has a long track record of human rights violations as well. But I have there's a memory that really stuck with me. I was in Xinjiang in 2007. And this was before the harsh clampdown that we see nowadays. And I couldn't get any journalistic work done on that tour. All my sources, all the people I was supposed to talk to had been silenced. And so one night I was sort of smuggled into a university campus, and the only way we found that I could talk to people was that we were walking in the dark on a running track. And then I was smuggled into the dormitory, and in this dormitory there were lots of students in one room, and they had like a piece of paper, and they passed it around like some treasure. And it was just an ordinary article by the International Herald Tribune that highlighted the cause of the situation of the Uyghurs. And I mean, to see how much that meant to them has really stuck with me. And so maybe it's not tactical to bring it up as a first subject when you go into bilateral talks, but we sure must keep the pressure up, I think.
So let me say about that. I have called for the Human Rights Council to investigate the claims in Xinjiang, and I think that that is an important thing to do. And I'm sure that there are human rights violations. I really would be shocked, and this may sound surprising to people, I would be shocked if anything comes close to rising to what the U.S. claims, which is genocide. I think that the use of the term genocide is a lie and a provocation, not a serious attempt. And when it was raised by Trump, one could say Trump lied about every single thing. Pompeo is... If Trump is the worst president we ever had, Pompeo is the worst foreign minister we ever had. Bar none, believe me. But then Biden picked it up. And why? If you look at the Human Rights Report this year, it says genocide in Xinjiang. Then it doesn't provide one sentence to justify the claim that this is a genocide. The word's used 2 times in the preface and in the China chapter. Turns out that the legal department of the State Department opposed it. It was overruled. I looked at that with one of the world's leading genocide experts who said, it's so absurd to use this word in this context. The person who wrote the 1,000-page handbook on genocide. So I asked myself, what's going on here? I believe we should have absolutely that President Bachelet should use the instrumentalities of the UN to investigate and to discuss. But if you really want a discussion, you don't start out with what is most likely a serious falsehood. And by the way, all the human rights groups, none of them has come back arguing for that. It's all based on tendentious, maybe you know these people, this Adrian Lenz, for example. There's one source over and over again. So, and the Australian something or other, which is part of their defense establishment. You know these groups better than I do. I see a game here, not a serious issue.
Not a serious concern.
Right, not only not a serious concern, but actually anything to make China in a bad light.
I can agree that, you know, using the term genocide is sort of clouds the discussion, and you know, they should look into the violations of human rights.
I agree that they should.
Yeah.
Moving a little bit on, because you mentioned, Jeff, the issue of especially of technology, of Huawei, and concerns over access to markets, and to sort of potential concerns over Chinese access, and especially with 5G and mobile technology. Has there been, I mean, and this is at the heart of some of the most challenging issues that we're discussing now with respect to international trade. Has there been any attempts made to agree internationally, and you're involved in many of these discussions, on what can be acceptable national security grounds for refusing imports of goods and services or investments by foreign companies, in order to try to sort of accommodate for these these discussions, and keep them sort of take them down, sort of not from this very politicized context to one there where it's possible to discuss what are the basis?
WTO keeps its hands off of this, basically. If a country argues that this is national security, WTO is much too weak to say to the United States, prove it. So we don't have international standards on the claims that are being made. I asked a lot of senior officials in telecoms and in tech, so what about Huawei? Is this true? I never heard, first of all, I've never seen a single piece of direct evidence on any claim that the U.S. has made. Not one. The UK for years had a process where they reviewed code, they made comments or complaints to Huawei, and Huawei had a big operation there to revise code to work together with the UK to show we do this together. Finally, the U.S. said to the UK, stop this, close down, otherwise we don't accept this. And so that was pushed aside. So I don't believe these claims. I also believe that my hypothesis is that if it's Ericsson or U.S. equipment, the U.S. can spy on me more easily than if it's Huawei equipment. That's my feeling. I'm sure I don't want to flatter myself, but once in a while, maybe by accident, they're listening to me a lot. And when I said that to one security expert, I said, I suppose the U.S. is listening to me, because I call senior officials all over the world. They say, Jeff, it's not one. How many did he say? 6. Of course they're listening to you. I think if it's Huawei, it's harder for the U.S. to spy. That's my basic take. Not that China's doing this or that, but that the U.S., of course, the U.S. spies on all of you if you happen to be engaged in something interesting to the U.S. Have no doubt about it. This is, I mean, it's not even for discussion. It's so obvious because and all of our our tech companies cooperate completely under the Patriot Act and all the rest. So everything that's being claimed, what these senior communications industry officials have repeatedly said to me is, Jeff, they know what can be done. They do it. So that's what they're against. So to my mind, Huawei had the unfortunate occurrence to get to 5G first, many years before the United States. So it was very important to break Huawei and to open up some time for something else to come in. I don't believe that there's much more there. On the other hand, I think cyber surveillance and cyber warfare and autonomous weapons and all the rest are completely out of control right now. We don't have treaties. We don't have anything in the AI space that we have for nuclear weapons or for, and it may be impossible. I don't know whether it's feasible or not. But when I listen to NATO generals talk, they scare the wits out of me, not about what they claim about the other side, but what they claim about what they're doing. Because Sonia and I were listening to NATO generals a couple of years ago saying, we can beat them, pure prisoner's dilemma. Not we should negotiate, but we can outcompete China on AI, and that's what we're determined to do. We're going to outrace them. No way, I believe. And by the way, that's also a U.S. belief. And if you want to read fascinating history of the whole atomic arms race and then onward, Martin Sherwin in the United States is, I think, our greatest historian of this. And during World War II, when the U.S. was developing the atomic bomb, many scientists raised many times, including Niels Bohr and others, we should get cooperation with the Soviet Union so that this thing doesn't get out of control after the Second World War. And of course, the politicians who knew little said, there's no way. The official U.S. intelligence was that it would take the Soviet Union 25 or 30 years to develop a nuclear weapon. There are probably great experts in this room on this, but this is my understanding. And of course, it took 4 years. And that was it. And that's where the U.S. makes all these mistakes, because there's also arrogance and complete intelligence failures repeatedly. And so I believe that it's the right way to think about this is that there's symmetry. If we can do it, they'll be able to figure out how to do it pretty quickly or ahead of us. And so we should think about this as a much more symmetric game. We can't outrun anyone, but maybe we could cooperate to be in the safe upper left-hand quadrant.
We're going to be going in for a landing soon, and we're already sort of spending a little bit of time. I hope you can bear with us. But I wanted to get your view, Jeff, on the fact that we've now been close to 2 years in a situation of a global pandemic, which in many ways offered us an opportunity to expand multilateral action and coming together to solve a truly global problem. At the same time, we've seen growing suspicions between the West and China over the origin of the virus and over the sharing of information. We've seen major issues concerning global collaboration on vaccine distribution, where we've had COVAX really failing to deliver on the need for vaccines in poor countries. Have we? Is this a missed opportunity? Are we now in a situation where we have had a setback in terms of multilateral collaboration? Where do we go from here?
I think the failure of cooperation has contributed to millions of deaths. So the things we're talking about, in my opinion, are not hypotheticals about the future, but are part of the failure of the COVID response already. There are many interesting things to say and learn about the COVID response. So let me talk about three parts of this crisis. One, the origins. The second, the control and containment. And third, the vaccine coverage, just very briefly. On the origins question, did China cause this? Was this a lab leak and so forth? First, nobody knows, and I'm very deeply steeped in the debate, not a protagonist in the debate, but a very close observer in the debate as head of this commission. But one thing I do feel is pretty likely, and that is if this happened to have been a lab leak, it was a joint US-China project and funded by the NIH. So I don't know whether it was or was not a lab leak, but if it was, the US paid for it.
That's surprising.
Yeah, and the reason is that the research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a joint US-China research program that I've learned a lot about. And it was not so safe, and it was not such a great idea, and it was not transparently reported, and it may well not have been the origin, but there's some chance that the work that was done in what is called chimeric viruses, where you create new forms of viruses by splicing together a SARS-like backbone of a virus with the S protein genes of other viruses and see how they do in infecting human cell lines, was a US-funded project. And the US has been dishonest about it, which I don't like. In other words, the US government has never explained this properly. So I don't like that. That's the origins question. When Trump started pointing to China, the US role was completely obscured. Then step by step, many reporters were saying, well, that research, isn't that something that this group was doing, US group? And then there was a period of a year where you couldn't get the documents. And then the Freedom of Information Act released documents a couple of months ago, and there was a lot that had not been explained and that was not pleasant to see, and that potentially was a source of a lab accident, or even a different kind of spillover of just researchers going out to the field to collect viruses and maybe collecting this one, SARS-CoV-2, by mistake. So that's on the origins. The two countries have been pointing fingers, but they've never collaborated on trying to understand this. The US made many tough claims against China. Biden had an intelligence effort, 90-day effort, which ended up inconclusive, but then very quiet, you notice. The US doesn't say anything more about this. And the reason is that too many fingers now point to the NIH as playing some role, and that opens up a whole can of worms because the NIH doesn't want to talk about what it does. It's also biosecurity and other things. So suddenly you open up a world that they don't want to open up, and that's why it's all gone quiet on this origins question. So that's origins. Second issue is containment. One thing is really interesting for us. China contained the transmission of the virus after the initial outbreak. I said that many times in the last 2 years in the United States. I was called a traitor, a liar, a fool, gullible, and so on. The fact of the matter is China stopped the transmission of the virus. Very interesting, by the way. They can do things we can't do. They can test 12 million people in a weekend in Beijing or Wuhan or other cities. I'd like to learn how that's done, frankly. But we don't even have a discussion about that together. I'm watching closely. There's no intellectual exchange at a government-to-government level to understand China's strategy, compare it with our strategy, understand what could be done. Unbelievable lack of curiosity, and a shame, because China figured out some really interesting things about how to contain outbreaks that we did not figure out. And not just repression and so forth. Taiwan did the same, Hong Kong did the same, and so on. Then comes the third point of this story, which is the vaccines. It's another failure because we actually could have a systematic vaccination of the world now, but we don't because we don't have a plan to do this. And COVAX, which Norway has strongly supported, is a good idea, but it failed. And it failed for a lot of reasons, but especially because the companies were never properly brought to the table. They were just out making their own contracts. Everyone decided to race for who could get the vaccines first. China's not at the table together with Moderna and Pfizer and AstraZeneca. So Sinovac and Sinopharm and CanBio, which are a couple billion doses, are not integrated in a coherent way in a global process. And so what's missing is senior US, European, Chinese, Indian, and Russian technicians and the governments and the companies in our countries sitting down with a spreadsheet saying, how are we going to get Benin covered? 40% by December, 70% by next June. How are we going to get Zambia covered? How are we going to get Bangladesh covered? And so on. We are not doing this. It's not hard to do this. I do this with my research assistants. We make it up because we don't have the companies at the table. But we know how much they produce, so we show plans how it can be done. But in order to actually get it done, we need to cooperate with China. We need to sit, and we need to tell the companies, by the way, you are companies, we are governments. We will tell you what to do right now because this is a global pandemic. We don't have the voice for that also. In the United States is, ooh, we're just government. You're companies. Tell us, how is this going to end, Pfizer? Okay, we'll tell you. We'll jack up the price to $34 a dose, give you 2 boosters, and call us again in 6 months. It's really like that. Our governments don't have the organizational heft to end this as it should be. And this is part of the issue. So all of this is to say, we are in the midst of a massive failure of cooperation. And it's taking lives and really costing us. And God forbid there should be a new variant that makes a breakthrough. All of what we feel right now as we sit without masks and feel that we're on the other side of this, who knows how we'll feel in 3 months or 6 months if we don't take more care of what we're doing right now. And just to add, climate change is a lot harder than this. And so it's no way that that's going to happen on its own. And so this is not only life or death in our own moment, but it's also an illustration of a massive, bollocksed up failure of cooperation that has a more general set of implications.
we're going to have to wrap up now, and there are, you know, as you said, Jeff, people who are hearing what you're saying, whether here or on your phone. Let's hope that they're also listening.
Siri is definitely listening and transcribing it and
listening and
sending
understanding. Please join me in giving Jeff and Sun Heidi a big hand of applause.